This video continues from IT Contracting Part 1. The following slides address some limitations to rights of use and some solutions to those limitations, followed by a practical real scenario to demonstrate a license agreement between a user and a software provider. This slide shows three common types of clauses in a right of use license and some disadvantages a user should be aware of. The first clause, the licensor grants the licensee the right to use, to copy, to revise, and decompile the licensed product. In this agreement, migration actions may be permitted unless the migration action does not fulfill the terms of that contract's particular purpose of use. The agreement would only allow porting and migration if they are necessary for the agreed functionality of the software.
Got keys?
The second clause, limitations of use, the right of porting, transfer, migration, in other system environments is excluded unless the licensor is obliged to give his consent according to the principle of equity and good faith. This clause forbids porting and migration unless the copyright owner is compelled to give consent due to the principle of equity and good faith. The user will only be able to adapt the software under this one exception, when the principle of equity and good faith declares the absence of the copyright owner's consent unreasonable under the circumstances. The third clause, revisions, upgrades, or any other interference with the software program are not permitted. This clause constitutes an extensive restriction of usage rights and may be in violation of a number of laws and treaties. The blanket prohibition of all adaptations violates Article 101 of the Treaty on the Functioning of the European Union, TFEU. Furthermore, such clauses may violate national laws governing the guidelines for general terms and conditions. For example, national guidelines do not allow a clause in general terms and conditions that prohibits error correction by third parties on behalf of the lawful acquirer. If the licensee modifies programs in the course of personal revisions without any commercial purpose, the prohibition of maintenance acts might be unreasonable. In addition to the aforementioned restrictions, the creation of backup copies may entail a number of restrictive clauses in license agreements and in framework contracts for digital preservation. Article 5.2 of the Computer Program Directive allows the digital storage of a copy of the original version of the software. Therefore, the licensee can use only one copy of the software at a time, or, in the instance of a network license, a definitive number of copies. Strictly for use in a disaster recovery scenario, the licensee may deposit an extra copy or several definitive copies of the software that are not in use. This provision prohibits the use of two circulating copies of the software at the same time. In some cases, having only one backup copy could amount to a threat to digital preservation. If more than one backup copy is required, then a specific amount of backups should be allowed. In other cases, the deposit of both the original version of the software and the deposit of a modified, for example, migrated version, might be allowed. If alteration of the software is permitted under the license, or if alteration of the software is required for the intended use of the program, then the reproduction of the altered software for storage should be allowed as fair practice. However, it is recommended that the licensee still request an agreement clause in the license. This slide discusses the solution of open source software and its advantages and disadvantages. In the previous slides, we have discussed proprietary software, software that requires a license to use and often entails restrictions to modification and distribution. Open source software, alternatively, grants the user greater freedom in the use, modification, and distribution of the software. Open source software lifts the contractual restrictions on actions required for digital preservation. Furthermore, open source software provides a technical solution to digital preservation by allowing access to the source code, facilitating complex adaptations of the program. Open source software, however, also comes with a few disadvantages by exposing the user to considerable risk. Open source software, for instance, lacks the product warranties provided by companies who sell proprietary software. The public availability of source code undermines the ability of businesses to protect commercially advantageous knowledge or know-how. Differences in national copyright law further complicate the use of open source software. Furthermore, some open source software is protected under a GNU General Public License, known as a copyleft license, which prevents users from distributing modifications of that software as proprietary. These copyleft licenses prevent users from making any financial gain from their modifications. This slide looks at a possible solution to the disadvantages posed by both proprietary software and open source software through dual licensing. Dual licensing allows the copyright holder to distribute parallel software under different license terms. Either the same software can be made available under two different categories of an open source license, or alternatively, under an open source license and a proprietary license simultaneously. Thus, the user would have the right to use the software under dual licenses. Dual licensing has a number of advantages. For instance, it would allow the software user to develop open source software for commercial gain. Dual licensing has advantages for software providers as well, by allowing them to distribute up-to-date versions under a proprietary license, while providing older versions under an open source license. Dual licensing provides a great opportunity for users of digital preservation systems. The user will be able to archive all old versions of the software and furthermore to freely access and migrate the archived material. Users will also be able to emulate deposited versions of software in future years. At the same time a version of software becomes available under an open source license, it may be needed to read an archived document. Dual licensing has the power to disburden digital preservation legally and commercially, and to simultaneously offer a desirable option for users. This slide reviews the steps towards obtaining the needed agreements with a software provider to pursue digital preservation. First, the company approaches a software house to explain its aims and requirements. Second, the parties will negotiate on terms. Last, after the parties agree on the contract, the license comes into effect. Digital preservation can then be carried out until the contract expires. For more detailed information about IT contracting and other legal issues that impact digital preservation, check out Legal Aspects of Digital Preservation, available through Edward Elgar Publishing. Thank you for your attention during this training tutorial brought to you by the Timbus Project. Please have a look at some of our other training videos and materials on the legal aspects of digital preservation and other tools for the preservation of business processes available on our webpage.